In this chapter, we're going to explore a very powerful control in the Telerik UI for .NET MAUI library, the chart. This dynamic tool makes data visualizing easy, but because it's so powerful, there are many features and configuration options to consider. Telerik UI charts utilize native graphics to render high-quality data visualizations. The data visualization library that comes with Telerik UI for .NET MAUI offers several types of charts, from line and bar charts to stock charts and even a pie chart. In our issue tracking application, we'll be using a stacked bar chart. This should give you a good sense of how to set things up and tweak any charting components that are available. We'll kick off the chapter by taking a quick tour of the anatomy of the chart, and then we'll roll up our sleeves and add a chart to the dashboard page, just as the new requirements for visualization dictate. We'll start with a simple chart configuration, and then we'll expand on that, exploring more available options as we go. All right, let's get the show on the road. When getting familiar with the Telerik UI chart, it's always good to know the structure of the chart, or the anatomy of the chart first. In the documentation, head on over to Controls and then Chart. You can take a look at the overview and how the chart works. These are the examples of some charts that are available. And then take a look at the visual structure. This is very important to learn because this also corresponds to the XAML structure that we're going to be building. All these different parts of the chart need to be defined separately. So this is the chart, and then we have different axes, horizontal and vertical. The horizontal axis can be different depending on the data set. Here you see an example of a categorical axis where you have different categories, apples, oranges, pears, and so on. You also have a numerical axis where these can be numbers, and you also have a special one for dates, which is what we're going to be using. If you take a look at the axis section briefly here, you'll see the different categorical, numeric, and date time continuous axis defined here. This is the one we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Now, what's special about the date time continuous axis is that your data set can contain some dates, but there might be some missing values, and the chart automatically extrapolates to fill in the blank values that are missing, so that the axis continuously shows a date range. Back to the visual structure, another very important concept to know is series. A chart can display multiple arrays of data at the same time using different graphical representations. Think of series as the array of data and how you want to display that array of data. For example, here you'll see a bar series. This is a bar chart and it's displaying one set of data. If we go back to the overview, here you'll see an area chart, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 series being displayed, and each series is set to be an area chart type of series. The different chart types are listed under chart types. Here we'll take a look at Cartesian, and if you scroll down a little bit to series, you'll see bar series, line series, spline area, and spline area. This is what a line series would look like as an example. Here we have 2 series. You can also control the way the grid looks in the background of the chart, the way the labels look, and then there's also a legend that you can configure, which is called Chart Legend, and this will give you the ability to label each one of the categories that are being displayed in different colors. You can think of this as a key for the chart. So there's a lot of different parts to the chart and a lot of different kinds of children to the main chart element that we're going to see. If you ever get confused, go back to the API documentation and you can find what's available listed here. In this lesson, we're going to set up our first chart and we're going to add it to the dashboard page, and specifically this area right here of the dashboard page. So head on over to the code and open up Views, Dashboard Page.xaml. And let's scroll down a little bit. You can see that our overall layout grid has areas for the picker, the initial display, and then the rest of the area is left for the chart, which is going to be down here underneath the border. So we're going to need to add the Telerik chart here, and it's going to be called a rad Cartesian chart because we're using that type of chart. There's also a rad pie chart available, but we're not going to be doing that in this course. And make sure that you add this chart to the proper grid row, and that's going to be row 2, and we're going to add the column span of 2. We're going to start this off by providing a very simple example of the chart, and then we'll integrate our data into it. So first, go to Getting Started, and then let's take a look at the chart structure here that we're going to need to take. We've already defined the Cartesian chart element. Now we need a binding context for the view model, horizontal axis, which is going to be a categorical axis this time around, and then we're going to switch to date axis later, and then a vertical axis, which is going to be a numeric axis. And then finally, we'll define this series. I'm going to copy this and we'll go through it one step at a time. Okay, Visual Studio is complaining about the fact that we don't have a view model defined, and that's fine. We'll take care of that momentarily. If we scroll down here, we'll take a look at the data structure that we're trying to build here. This is the structure for a categorical data item, a single item or a single point on the chart. It defines the value and the category. The values for the y-axis, the categories for the x-axis. So let's start here. I'm going to copy this class here. Let's head over to our view models dashboard. And right next to dashboard view model, I'm going to create a new view model. So a new class. I'm going to call this one chart view model. Let's make this a public class. Now, this is not going to be our data item. Our data item class, I'm just going to paste this right here in the same namespace. So we're going to have two classes here. One is the data item. Of course, the proper thing to do would be to separate this out, but this is only temporary. So just for demonstration purposes. So don't worry about that being there. Now, this chart view model is what we need to bind our chart to. So let's go back to the chart and we're going to set the binding context to point to our chart view model. We need to import that view model namespace up here. XML namespace. I'm going to call that one dashboard, and it's going to point to our dashboard view models. Okay, so now I can go back down here, and instead of local, this is going to be dashboard, and then we'll select chart view model. Let's clean this up a little bit. So now our chart is being data bound to chart view model. Inside the view model, which is now in the context of the chart, we're going to be binding this series, which is going to be bound to a data property. So data needs to be an array, and the types that we're going to use for the array are these categorical data types. Let's go back here to the documentation. They have it called view model. We have it called chart view model. Basically, it's the same idea. I'm going to copy this code from inside the class and paste it into our chart view model. Just need to rename that constructor to chart view model. So what happens here? Well, we have a property called data, and it is an observable collection. I called it an array, but it's an observable collection because that's the type that plays well with the chart. When we update the items in data, the observable collection notifies our chart automatically and the UI gets updated. So that's why we're using observable collection here. We initialize it to categorical data. And here we're just hard coding the data to have a few categorical data items. These are the categories and these are the values. Now what's happening here? Here we're binding this series item and we're using the bar series chart type. The item source is set to data, which matches this collection right here. And inside that collection, each item has category property. Now we're looking over here at this object of category. And the value binding is going to be pointing to the value property, which is this right here, which is a number. So let's take a quick look at what this looks like. I'm going to go to dashboard, and there is our chart. You can see our categories are listed along the horizontal axis, and the chart automatically figures out what values to display on the numeric axis based on the data that's available in the chart. Now we can also change the type of series we're using here just by going into the series and changing it to, for example, area series. And now we have an area chart. We can also change this to line series. This gives us a line chart. Notice the jagged edges. And if we set this to spline series, it gives us nice smooth curves. So that's a basic chart setup. In the next lesson, we're going to get our own data populating in the chart, and we're going to use two sets of series. In this lesson, we're going to populate our chart with our demo data, which is going to be a little bit different than what we've seen in the previous lesson. We're not going to be using the categorical axis. We're going to switch this to a date-time continuous axis. Right now, we're using a categorical axis. We're going to change this to date-time continuous axis. Why? Well, if we take a look at the dashboard view model, you'll see that we're actually working with date-time ranges. So we want the open issues to be displayed as a series and the closed issues to be displayed as a series. So we need to pull that data out right over here where we load the data in our dashboard view model. So let's make a little section here for our chart data. And I'm actually going to paste in some code and explain it to you. First, we're going to go to the repository and get the filtered issues, passing in the filter. Then we have something called chart VM, and this is going to be an instance of the chart view model, but we're going to have it in our page dashboard view model. So we're going to create a new property up here, and it's going to be an instance of chart view model called chart VM. So in the constructor here, we're just going to create a new one. And now down here in load data, we can continue populating it. Our chart VM is going to have open items and closed items. This loop right here goes through the filtered issues, and the categories unfiltered issues are actually a list of date times. You can see that right there in the IntelliSense. And that's why we're using the date time continuous axis here. For every single value item, we're going to have a display model called temporal data, which is going to have a date, that's going to be the category for the x-axis, and the value, which is going to have the count of open items and the count of closed items. So I know that's quite a lot to take in right now, but you always have the code to have a look at it and to study it in more detail. Now, the chart view model is going to have open items data and closed items data, and these are going to be very similar to what we had before. We have an observable collection of categorical data called data. So now we're just going to have copies of this, 2 copies. They're both going to be observable collections for each of the series items. One is going to be called open items data, and the other one is going to be called closed items data. And instead of an observable collection of categorical data, we need a new type here called temporal data. I'm going to do it right up here. I'm going to make a copy of the categorical data class, and I'm going to call it temporal data for time. That's going to take into account a date here, which is going to be of type date time. So now let's just go down here and change these to temporal data types. So now we're going to be binding each series to these 2 instead of the old data. In fact, I'm just going to comment out the old data so it doesn't get in the way. And I'm going to comment out get categorical data method as well. In fact, I'm just going to delete these so they're not getting in the way. But I will keep them in the finished project just so that you have that for reference if you want to play around with that. This is a lot cleaner now. If we go back to dashboard view model, you'll see that we're filling the data quite nicely here. Now there is something we need to fix up in the series here. We're not binding to data anymore. We're going to be binding to open items data and closed items data. The value binding will remain the same, but the category binding will be changed to date. One last thing we need to do is in the constructor here, we need to instantiate each one of these collections. Otherwise, we'll get an exception thrown. And there we go. Now let's test this out. Now this is not going to work just yet. There's one more thing we need to do. You can see that there's no data here, and that's because the binding context is actually being created separately for the chart. We're defining the binding context here in the XAML, which means this model right here is being created brand new. So this model is not the same chart VM that we're creating here in the dashboard view model, so it doesn't have all that data. So instead of this kind of binding context, we're going to need to specify an existing binding context that we've already created. So up here in the rad Cartesian chart, I'm going to specify the binding context here and use the binding to our chart VM property on the dashboard view model. All right, let's give this a shot. Okay, and here's our chart. Notice we're using the spline type of chart, and down at the bottom we have quite a mess. We're going to fix that in a moment. It's just listing the years. How do we control all this stuff? Well, there's a couple of things we need to do. First of all, we need to display both the open items and the closed items, but I wanted to show you a different type of chart, so I kept that as spline charts. Let's make a copy of the spline series, and we're going to bind this one to closed items data. That way we see both of them at the same time. And I'm going to change one of these to bar series. And this way you'll be able to see that we can show different types of series displayed on the same chart. And there we go. Now you can see the bar series, which is the closed items, and the spline series all plotted on the same chart. Now I'm going to change both of these to bar series. And when you do that, we get a stacked bar chart displaying both the open and closed items together. Now what about the labels? Well, we'll come back and take care of that next. In this lesson, we'll take a look at how to control the labels and the legend of the chart. Right now, we just have a datetime continuous axis, and it's displaying the years along the horizontal axis by default. And as you can see, that's pretty difficult to read. So we're going to change that. Let's go over here to the code, and in the XAML, we can specify how the datetime continuous axis behaves. There's something called label fit mode, and we can set it to multi-line,
none, or rotate. Let's set it to rotate. And what that's going to do is figure out how much space each label needs and rotate it just enough to make the label still legible. And this is pretty good. However, our array of data contains months, and it doesn't really make sense or even give us any information to have the horizontal axis display years. There's something else we can set here, and it's called major step unit. And we can set this to day, hour. We can go down to milliseconds if we want to, but what we really want here is month, because that's what's in our data set. And there we go. Now we're displaying months. And let's say we switch this to 3 months. The chart responds because we're using that observable collection, and we still have the month labels down at the bottom. If we set this to 1 year or 6 months, the chart responds appropriately. Another useful bit of UI that goes along with the chart is sometimes you might want to use a legend to let the users know what the different color bars mean. There is a legend control in the collection, but it's not a child of the Cartesian chart. It relates to the Cartesian chart, and I'll show you how to do that right now. So we're going to create a new component outside of the chart, and it's going to be a rad legend, and we're going to temporarily just place it anywhere on the screen. You probably want to make a special row for it or design it how you like in the layout. I'm going to place it in grid row 2 and column 1. It's not going to look the best, but it'll give you an idea of what the legend could look like. Now, since this is a different element and it's not a child of the chart, it needs to point to the chart. And we use a legend provider to do that with an X reference and the name of the control that provides the data for the legend. In this case, chart. Our chart is currently not named, so we got to go back to the chart and provide the X name attribute and call this chart. You can call it whatever you want. I just happen to call mine chart, but make sure that this name matches the reference name. Now you'll see that we have 2 little squares up here without any labels. We'll fix that momentarily, of course, but this is pulling the data from the chart. And if there was more series here, the legend will have more squares. Now, how do we get labels up there? Well, each bar series is linked to that legend, but it's not providing its name. So we got to go back to the series and add a display name. For this one, it's going to be open. And for the closed ones, it's going to be closed. And that display name is going to be pulled into the legend. So now we can identify easily what these different colors mean according to the legend.